So hello and welcome to this Introduction to Cultural Studies NPTEL course, where we're looking at Judith Butler's Gender Trouble. And we had finished with the main text. We're looking at the conclusion at the moment. And on your screen, you find on page 183 of this particular book, where she talks about the language of appropriation. And obviously, right before this lecture, in the previous lecture, we saw how she's critiquing, or she's critical of this idea of the Western metaphysical tradition of looking at a subject and object as a dichotomy. And she says, as long as you have the dichotomy, as long as you have that kind of a dualism in subject position, then the politics of representation, the problematic of representation cannot be solved, right? So she's critical of any idea of a pre-discursive I, any idea of an existential I which is pre-discursive in quality, and she's critical of that. She's critiquing that kind of a tradition, and she said it comes down from Marx, it comes down from Lukács, and it informs a lot of liberatory discourses in a Western tradition. But as long as you have that kind of a tradition, it's difficult to do away with or to solve the problematics of representation. And also what she did what we examined in the previous lecture is that she looks at how the feminist identity politics, with its illegitimacy, with its inexhaustibility, the fact that it is it's limitless, there's no limitation in terms of the variables that a feminist identity politics can posit. Instead of looking at the limitlessness of variables as a problem, as a paradox, as an ambiguity, she looks at the way in which that becomes a possibility of subversion, right? The fact that we can add variables ad infinitum, at different points of time, different variables come in, and that becomes an important condition for Butler. And she celebrates the condition. She celebrates that centerlessness in terms of feminist identity. And this idea of centerlessness, the celebration of centerlessness, makes Butler sort of attitudinally allied to postmodernism. And this is why I keep saying that Butler is a figure who connects postmodernism with post-structuralism, and also obviously she is one of the seminal figures of gender politics or gender theory, right? Okay. So we come to page 183 on the screen. She looks at a language of appropriation, and she says, the language of appropriation, instrumentality, and disintegration germane to the epistemological mode also belong to a strategy of domination that pits the I against an other, right? So again, she's back to sort of the critique and the dualism of the Western metaphysical tradition, and she says the language of appropriation, the language of instrumentality, the language of domination, obviously allied in an epistemological way to a strategy of domination. It pits an I against the other, right? So the I and the other exist at a sort of ontological remove from each other, right? And that can obviously be a binaristic way of looking at the subject position as a pre-discursive, self. Okay, and once that separation is effected, it creates an artificial set of questions about the knowability and recoverability of that other, right? So obviously the language of appropriation, it necessitates a separation from the I and the other. And once the separation is effected, according to Butler, it creates a set of artificial set of questions. You might say it's an artificial discursive field which is constructed in order to sort of find out or in order to theorize the knowability and recoverability of the other. So you can go back to Bhabha, you can go back to Bhabha's idea of the other question, which is exactly about this, where he says quite clearly that the other is actually manufactured through discursive processes. The other is constructed through epistemological processes that that aim to sort of contain the other, to make the other a knowable construct, something which can be knowable, something which can be known at any given point in time, something which can be classified at any given point in time. At the same time, the other can be recovered at any given point in time, because other is formed, mind you, from the position of privilege, from the hegemonic position, from the hegemonic subject position. It requires the formation of the other, right? And Butler says quite clearly over here that as long as you have the self-other dichotomy, the subject-object dichotomy, this language of appropriation will always succeed in popular discourses in different discursive conditions. Okay. And then she goes on to say, as part of the epistemological inheritance of contemporary political discourses of identity, this binary opposition is a strategic move within a given set of signifying practices, one which establishes the I in and through this opposition, and which reifies the opposition as a necessity, concealing the discursive apparatus by which the binary itself is constituted. So this should be clear to you by now, because this is something we've been talking about since the very inception of this particular course, and how any construction of a binary, any economy of a binary system, it relies on certain signifying practices, and those signifying practices are reified, right? So they're ritualized and reified in a way which conceals its constructed quality. So obviously, any dominant discourse which becomes a grand narrative. Obviously, we look at a grand narrative with I and the self, and the I in the other way, and that is the grand narrative being talked about over here. So any grand narrative would require its rituals, would require its repeatable rituals. Any grand narrative becomes a grand narrative by repeatability. So repeatability becomes a condition for any grand narrative, right? So, and the constructed quality must be concealed to repeatability. And this is what Butler says over here. It conceals the discursive apparatus by which the binary itself is constituted. So the very fact that it's a binary, which is artificially created, this fact must be concealed. Now, how does the concealment happen? This concealment happens through acts of repetition. Right? So repetition, replicability, reification. So these are the procedures through which the constructed quality is effaced. So effacing the constructed quality becomes a necessary condition for any dominant discourse. And I've probably said this a dozen times already in discourse, but it's one of the most important things one must remember, that effacing the constructed quality must be a necessary condition for any dominant discourse. In order to be a grand narrative, it must be able to successfully efface its constructed quality. If you discover its constructed quality, if you find out it's a constructed quality, it's a construct, then obviously the very claim to be a grand narrative, the very claim to be a pre-discursive narrative will fail, will collapse. Okay, then you find out, you figure out this is discursive quality, and then you begin to question the discursive quality, and then you find out the apparatus which had informed the discursive conditions, and then obviously the deconstruction can happen. But in order for that not to happen, it must conceal its discursive constructed quality. Okay. The shift from an epistemological account of identity to one which locates the problematic within practice of signification permits an analysis that takes the epistemological mode itself as one possible and contingent signifying practice. Further, the question of agency is reformulated as a question of how signification and re-signification work. In other words, what is signified as an identity is not signified at a given point of time, after which it simply there is an inert piece of intended language. Clearly, identities can appear as so many inert substantives. Indeed, epistemological models tend to take this appearance as a point of theoretical departure. However, the substantive I only appears as through such signifying practice that seeks to conceal its own workings and to naturalize its effects. So what this entire section, which I just read out, shows us that how agency is formulated and reformulated to certain signifying practices. However, those signifying practices, those workings, those constructed quality must be naturalized, right? So the question of agency obviously is related to the question of dominance, to the question of superiority, to the question, because agency comes with a sort of a supposed hierarchy. Someone has more agency than someone else, right? And this idea of an unequal agency obviously is an artificial creation, it's an artificial condition, it's a deeply discursive condition. However, the discursive condition, the workings within this particular discursive field must be naturalized. If you can't naturalize it, obviously then you begin to question it, then you begin to ask questions about a hierarchy, ask questions about the inequality of agency, and then obviously the discursive condition, the discursive quality will be revealed. Okay. Further, to qualify as a substantive identity is an arduous task. For such appearance are rule-generated identities, ones which rely on the consistent and repeated invocation of rules that condition and restrict culturally intelligible practices of identity. So again, the question of repetition becomes crucial over here. So such rules, such rule-generated identities, which are obviously artificial identities, those artificial rule-generated identities must be, repeated over and over again. So there's a degree of infinity in repetition. And the more you can repeat it, the more visibly, the more spectacularly you can repeat it, the more successful you'll be in terms of concealing its constructed quality, right? So indeed, to understand identity as a practice and as a signifying practice is to understand culturally intelligible subjects as a resulting effects of a rule-bound discourse that inserts itself in the pervasive and mundane signifying acts of linguistic life. Right? So linguistic life obviously is a language condition of life around us, which is deeply discursive in quality. Language is one of the most discursive things which we consume, which we inhabit, and which we perpetuate in our daily lives. And that kind of a linguistic feel, a linguistic life, is embedded with rule-bound discourses. And those discourses which are rule-bound, are culturally produced, and those discourses which are culturally produced actually inform identity or the production of identity. In other words, identity, there can be no such thing as a pre-linguistic, pre-discursive, pre-cultural identity. So identity is a part of the process of cultural production, right? So this is again going back to the idea of reification, and Butler actually alludes to reification in this particular section. It's an act of commodification, it's an act of cultural production. So identities are acts of cultural production, linguistic production, which are deeply embedded with discursive fields. So we can't possibly divorce the discursivity from identity. And this brings us back to what we said in the previous lecture, that identity and discursivity are attitudinally and ontologically embedded with each other. They're entangled with each other. We can't separate out the two. Okay, and then she talks about language as being, an entanglement of abstraction and materiality. And this is something, again, we have been saying since the very inception of this particular course. Abstractly considered, language refers to an open system of science by which intelligibility is insistently created and contested. As historically specific organizations of language, discourses present themselves in the plural, coexisting with temporal frames and instituting unpredictable and inadvertent convergences from which specific modalities of discursive possibilities are engendered. So the key word over here is engendered, produce. So discursive possibilities are produced through certain temporal frames, to certain specific organizations of language, to certain specific signifying practices, right? So language is actually an open system of science by which intelligibility is insistently created and contested. Intelligibility is meaning production, meaningfulness. So meaningfulness becomes an act of production. Meaningfulness becomes an act of contestation. So what is meaningful, what is not meaningful, these are contested categories. These are produced categories, productive categories, reifying categories. These acts of reification, these acts of production, these acts of contestation can take place only in certain discursive fields, discursive frames. This is what Butler says quite clearly. As historically specific organizations of language, discourses present them. So she defines discourses in a very interesting way. She said discourses are historically specific organizations of language, right? So language and discourse go hand in hand, because language, you can substitute the word language with representation, right? Discursively, specific organizations of representation, those are discourses, right? So specific organizations of language, historically specific organizations of language are discourses, and those discourses present themselves in a plural, coexisting with temporal frames. So each discourse is spatio-temporal in quality, right? Each discourse is historical in quality. They occupy certain temporal frames. They inhabit certain temporal frames. And you cannot possibly look at discourses as an atemporal condition, a temporal category. There's no such thing as a temporal discourse. Each discourse is temporally constructed, temporally constituted, right? So this temporality of discourse is something which should be foregrounded, highlighted with the way that Butler does in her post-structuralist way of looking at discursivity. And this instituting unpredictable and inadvertent convergences from which specific modalities of discursive possibilities are engendered. So discursive possibilities are produced through certain convergences of discourse, language, apparatus of power, systems of signification, etc. Those come together, those converge together to create certain modalities of discourse and discursive possibilities, which are produced by these particular convergences. Okay. So as a process, signification harbors within itself what the epistemological discourse refers to as agency. The rules that govern intelligible identity, that is, that enable and restrict the intelligible assertion of an I. So every act of I, every intelligible identity formation is sort of bound by meaningfulness. In order for any act of assertion, that act of assertion must be intelligible in quality. And we talked about, if you remember, a couple of lectures ago, we talked about intelligible genders by Butler, described by Butler, genders which conform to certain narratives of expectation, to certain economy of expectation, etc. Right? So those intelligible assertion of an I, rules that are partially structured along matrices of gender hierarchy and compulsory heterosexuality, operate through repetition. And this is a bit of a it's a cliche in cultural studies. It's a very, very crucial cliche. I mean, it sounds like an oxymoron, but cliches are very important, and this is what Butler says over here. The gender hierarchy or gender identity, obviously the dominant gender identity, the dominant gender hierarchy is the compulsory heterosexuality, and this supposed compulsory nature, the compulsory quality of heterosexuality is operated through repetition, right? So that becomes a grand narrative of sexual identity. That becomes a grand narrative of gender identity, compulsory heterosexuality, right? So that compulsory heterosexuality becomes a grand narrative, and that grand narrative operates through repetition. And also, what Butler doesn't say over here, but she has said it before many times, it also operates through concealment, right? So concealment and repetition become the sort of crucial conditions, a necessary condition for compulsory heterosexuality to operate as a grand narrative. So any act of grand narrative formation, any operation of a grand narrative relies on repetition and concealment. These become the two very important categories according to Butler. And of course, you can relate back to Bhava, you can go back to Bhava as well. And there too we have seen a compulsory hierarchy, a compulsory racial supremacy over there. That was a grand narrative in a colonial condition that Bhava had explored. And over to there too, we had seen how repetition and permanence, fixity and repetition, fixity and play become very, very crucial conditions for that grand narrative to be operative in the first place. Okay. Indeed, when a subject is said to be constituted, that means simply that a subject is a consequence of certain rule-governed discourses that govern the intelligible invocation of identity. So, identity becomes an act of intelligible invocation. So unless you can invoke your identity intelligibly, you will not make any sense, you'll not be accepted as an identity, you'll not be part of this grand narrative of identity, which obviously is dominant in quality, right? So it requires a certain causal relationship, a certain causal sort of interaction with the rule-governed discourses. So those rule-governed discourses are there as artificial constructions, and every act of signification, every act of subjectification is a process of negotiation with those rule-governed discourses, right? So that rule-governed discourses are the only ones which invoke intelligible identities. Okay, the subject is not determined by the rules through which it is generated, because signification is not a founding act, but rather a regulated process of repetition that both conceals itself and enforces itself as rules precisely to the production of substantializing effects. So the subject is not determined by the rules by which it's generated, because signification is not a founding act. Signification doesn't want to create a subject. Signification is a regulatory act. Signification is a containing mechanism. It is a regulatory mechanism which will try to contain a subject within a certain discursive field. The discursive field is predetermined, and the subject must be contained within a discursive field through acts of repetition, right? Through acts of concealment, through acts of artificiality which are concealed, right? And of course, that becomes very important. And we're back again to the idea of repetition and concealment being crucial categories in any identity politics. In a sense, all signification takes place within the orbit of compulsion to repeat. So every act of signification also entails a compulsion to repeat. So repetition and signification go hand in hand in discursive fields. So that's something that Butler points out very, very radically. Agency then is to be located within the possibility of a variation of that repetition. So agency becomes, and this is going back to Lyotard a little bit, if you remember Lyotard's idea of language games. So agency becomes an active language game over here. The rules are pre-established, but how do you negotiate with the rules? How do you sort of permute and combine the rules? That would generate agency in the first place. So agency is basically a variation of the repetition. So that repetition is a compulsory condition, and agency becomes a variation within a narrative of repetition, right? That's what Butler points out very clearly over here. If the rules governing signification not only restrict, but enable the assertion of alternative domains of cultural intelligibility, that is, new possibilities of gender that contest the rigid codes of hierarchical binarisms, then it is only within the practices of repetitive signifying that a subversion of identity becomes possible. So the subversion of identity only becomes possible within the rules which are pre-established. So it's a combination of rules, it's a permutation of rules through which a subversion of identity becomes possible in the first place. So the subversion cannot be a pre-discursive phenomenon. Subversion cannot be a meta-discursive phenomenon. Subversion is embedded in discursivity, right? It's only within those rules can subvert your meaning, your identity, your sexuality, your gender politics, your acts of representation, etc. The injunction to be given, to be a given gender produces necessary failures, a variety of incoherent configurations that in their multiplicity exceed and defy the injunction by which they are generated. So again, we're back to the idea of failure. But over here, failure to conform, failure to be complete, failure to be total to Butler becomes a possibility, right? So the injunction to be to be, to exist, a given gender produces necessary failures. So the injunction to conform to certain pre-established gender rules and gender codes and gender bodies, they entail certain failures, because conformity is an incomplete act. We saw that in a couple of lectures ago, where we saw Butler quite clearly say that every act of conformity becomes an act of incompletion. However, that incompletion produces a gap or contains a gap from which subversion can be produced. Subversion can be sort of enacted from that gap, that sort of the incompletion, that limitlessness. So the injunction to be, to exist, a given gender produces necessary failures, a variety of incoherent configurations, and that in the multiplicity exceed and defy the injunction by which they're generated. So the only defiance that can be produced is within the rules, within the game, within a narrative, right? So the injunctions can be defied, injunctions can be deconstructed only by acts of failures. Failure to conform, failure to abide, failure to be complete. Only in acts of failures can injunctions be, subversions be generated within those injunctions. Okay. Further, the very injunction to be a given gender takes place through discursive routes, right? So the very injunction, the very command, the very ordering to be a given gender is a discursive ordering, a discursive command and quality. To be a good mother, to be a heterosexually desirable object, to be a fit worker, in sum, to signify a multiplicity of guarantees in response to the variety of different demands all at once. So we look at the definitions over here. The desirable categories over here, the desirable discursive categories, good mother, heterosexually desirable object, fit worker, is all part of the productive matrix, the matrix of production. Mothering, to parent a child, to produce a child, to parent a child, to be a good worker, to produce wealth, to produce capital, etc. A fit worker, a heterosexual desirable object, part of the commodity production process, etc. All these definitions, all these categories are very much embedded in the narrative of commodification, in the narrative of reification. That for Butler becomes a grand narrative of gender identity as well. So in a very interesting sense, we can see how Butler draws on Marxism, how Butler draws on the idea of reification and alienation in terms of looking at gender identity production and reproduction. And that's a very radical thing, to bring in Marxism, to bring in postmodernism, to bring in post-structuralism in terms of looking at gender politics and gender identity productions. Okay. The coexistence or convergence of such discursive injunctions produces the possibility of a complex reconfiguration and redeployment. So reconfiguration and redeployment become very crucial categories for Butler, because it's only through reconfigurations and redeployment can we have possibilities of subversion. So again, we're back to this Lyothardian idea of language games. It's only within the language games can we permute and combine and produce different acts of subversion, right, which can be potentially subversive in quality, which can deconstruct potentially. It is not a transcendental subject who enables action in the midst of such a convergence. There is no self that is prior to the convergence of who maintains integrity prior to his entrance into this conflictual or conflicted cultural field. There's no sense, there's no self which is integrity, which is integral in quality, which is interiorized in quality, which is pre-discursive in quality, right? So there's no self which exists, a removal, at an example of removal, at a position of removal from this kind of convergence of different kind of discursive fields. So there's no self that is prior to the convergence or who maintains integrity prior to the entrance in this conflicted cultural field. So this cultural field and the sense of self are embedded with each other, are synchronous with each other, right? So there's no sequential relationship, there's no sequentiality over here. It's part of a synchronicity, right? So Butler's looking at a synchronicity rather than sequentiality. She's looking at a self and the discursive field as more of a distributive phenomenon rather than a hierarchical top-down phenomenon, okay? There's only a taking up of tools where they lie, where the very taking up is enabled by the tool lying there. It's how you take up the tools, how you play with the tools, how you appropriate the tools, how you misappropriate the tools that determine your subjectivity, that determine your agency, right? So where the very taking up is enabled by the tool lying there. So you can only take up the tools because the tools are lying there already. So there's no condition where the tools are not there. The tools are already always there. And it's a question of how you take up the tools, how you play with the tools, what are the ludic possibilities, the playful possibilities that you can create by your appropriation of the tools. That determines your agency, that determines your subjectivity. So the human subject can never exist at a pre-discursive condition. right? The tools are always there. The discursive instruments are always there. The instrumentality is always there. It's how do you negotiate with the instruments? How do you sort of deal with the tools that determine your human subjectivity, that determine your agency? And that, according to Butler, is a true subjectivity, the true agency that must be examined, that must be understood, not as a pre-discursive given, but as very much a part of discursivity. So again, we battle this condition of identity and discursivity embedded with each other, entangled with each other in this particular medium. So I conclude this lecture today, and we'll continue and hopefully finish up this particular text in a couple of lectures to come. Thank you for your attention.